After a centuries-long struggle, the British and French finally met on the battlefield for a decisive clash for world dominance, the 7 Years' War. The victor would see the entire world open to them, a world they could take their place in as the sole global power for the entirety of the foreseeable future. In our timeline, the British fulfilled this role, but what if instead it had been the French? The 7 Years' War. France's World War One. Well, I guess France's World War One would just be World War One, but let me explain what I mean. For Germany, World War One was their chance to secure the top spot in the global pecking order. A victory would leave them as the dominant force in world politics. World War Two, however, was a reactionary snap to their defeat in World War One, an all-or-nothing final try for world domination, this time through direct conquest and subjugation. The 7 Years' War acted in the same way to France as World War I did to Germany, a conventional war in which their victory would leave them the most influential and powerful player in global politics. The Napoleonic Wars then acted as World War II did for Germany, an all-out war of direct conquest. So before I look at the more popular topic of what if France had won the Napoleonic Wars, let's look back at the 7 Years' War and ask, what if the French had won? And the reality of the situation was that it seemed like they were going to. Their alliance of themselves, Austria, Russia, and later Sweden greatly outnumbered the British alliance, being only themselves and Prussia. It was only until 1958 that the war turned away from the French's favor, but even then victory was still mostly in their grasp. As such, only a few changes have to be made if we want to see a French victory in the war. First off is just a general better performance of the French Navy. Any bit more effective they are takes away from the British's main advantage, their naval dominance. Next, we turn to India, where the French are successful in seizing British holdings in the subcontinent. Finally, we look to Prussia in 1958, where they lose two decisive battles that just barely gave them enough breathing room to survive against the surrounding nations coming down on them. The Battle of Rossbach to the French and the Battle of Lutzen to the Austrians. With victories in these battles, the French alliance moves into Prussia from all sides. The French from the west, the Austrians from the south, the Swedish in the north, and in 1959, the Russians from the east. That year, the Prussians would be left no choice but to surrender, ceding the wealthy region of Silesia back to the Austrians. This leaves the British with no more serious holdings around the world except for in North America, where the French, like in our timeline, would be scoring victory after victory. The British are forced to surrender. Along with the aforementioned Prussian ceding of Silesia to Austria, the British would lose all territory in North America and India to the French, as the French had to the British in our timeline. In the coming years, the French would go about extending their control over India, and the subcontinent would be left entirely to them. Back in Germany, the Prussians' rise to dominance would be stopped in its tracks, and it would lose any chance of becoming the head of a unified German nation. Instead, Austria would remain the biggest influence in the German states, though I doubt they would ever push for unification, as it would do nothing but overstretch them and it would be unmanageable. Britain would leave the war broke as in our timeline, but without any 13 colonies to tax or India to plunder. Instead, they would be left without the ability to do much of anything in the expansion department, and may be subject to revolution and civil unrest as the French were after their defeat in the 7 Years' War. And so the world would be left open to the French, as the world enters into a new age, the Pax Gallia. When you imagine North America in this timeline, what do you picture? If you're imagining the United States filled with Quebecois, I'm sorry to report it wouldn't end up like that. You see, the French were very different from the British in their colonization of America. While the French were brutal colonizers in most of history, and they certainly thought of themselves as superior to the natives, they were comparatively rather gentle to the Native Americans, because they had something the French wanted: fur. The French were big fans of the various furs exclusive to North America. So instead of slaughtering the only people who knew how to effectively gather them, they set up trade relations with the natives in their territories, and largely left them alone, only setting up concentrated settlements in certain areas. This left the natives to fight amongst each other to gain land for hunting furs. A consequence of this would be the eventual rise of certain tribes to powerful status, especially as the native population recovered a lot more than in our timeline. Whether or not they could ever get to the point where they could kick out the French colonizers and we'd be left with native nation states in North America, or if the French would maintain a loose confederacy of native tribes that swore fealty to them, is up to interpretation. But one thing is for certain, this timeline is a lot better for natives of North America who would be around in much greater numbers nowadays than in our timeline. As the 1700s turned into the 1800s, the French would finish their conquest of India and the eyes of Europe would turn to Africa. Britain, being a much weaker force, wouldn't be as big of a contender, leaving the French the dominant force, facing off against the Spanish, Portuguese, and maybe even the Austrians for control of Africa, with some small colonization by Britain. By the end of this world's Victorian age, France would remain the dominant power, with Russia and Austria acting as other imperial rivals. Depending on whether or not a great demoralizing war like World War I occurs, the French may maintain this position in their empire, or, as the wheel of the world turns, they may fall, as all empires seem to do. But one thing is for certain, the world would be drastically different if the French came out on top in the 7 Years' War.